All righty. So when we look at Highland society and the Crofting society that emerge that we have sort of encountered periodically throughout this semester, one of the things that we've noted over that period, right, is that the sort of lifestyle of the people of the Highlands is different from the lifestyle of other people throughout Scotland, right? And in this world of contradictions that we have continuously come back to, and how I have talked about Scotland being this land of contradictions, right? It's important for us to see that, again, we are sort of in we are coming to that again, right? We are coming into one of those areas of contradiction again, as Scotland is massively urbanizing in the 1800, and certainly by the time you get to the end of the 1800s, right, this sort of mass urbanization that has happened in Scotland. There are still these groups of poor Highlanders working on the fields, and their families are going to be subjected to some really awful changes, right? And again, we think about Scotland being this place of the Enlightenment, and a place where again, it's a place of the Enlightenment, and the place that sort of talks about better treatment of people. But then you have in this period you have people getting kicked off their land. So we'll be talking about that. We will also be looking at the Irish potato famine, which turns into the Scottish potato famine, which turns into the end of the 1840s. We call the 1840s the starving, the hungry 40s, right? So all of these will be part of our conversation here. So I want to just talk about what a croft is. This word is one that we have encountered in the past. So a croft is a small plot of land on which a farmer rents their land and farms it for sustenance and for small, generally, sort of small subsistence farming, right? It is not a huge piece of land, and it is often chopped up from larger plots of land. And really, one of the big things about crofting society is that, and this is important for us to sort of remember here, is that intentionally, the landlord usually has chunked these pieces of land to be as small as possible, so that no single farmer can survive only on planting on this piece of land, right? And why would there be that incentive for the landlord, right? Why would the landlord want to make a piece of land so small that it could not sustain an entire family? Anybody think of a reason why? Oh, Alex, sorry, go ahead. Didn't see your hand up.
Potentially because they could get them to have to give up like the farm back to the owners so that they could eat for themselves, or also in another aspect, like they would have to rent more property so that they would make more money from them, because they would have to rent more in order to be able to afford to survive.
Okay, so part of it is, I think as Alex rightly says, right, part of it is this, they're going to need to plant other pieces of land, or they're going to need to get more land in order to increase their wealth. There's also another reason. Anybody? Well, okay. So the other reason is, right, if I can make it such that you cannot sustain yourself only by the produce of your field, well, then maybe if I need you to do some kelping for me, or if I need you to do some other work for me, there's an incentive there for you to earn some hard cash to supplement your poor growing area. Does that make sense? Right. So it's a nefarious idea here where not, yeah, I don't want to make it sound like they're forcing them to do favors. It's really more of forcing, giving them so little property that when me as the landlord approaches them and says, oh, hey, I have this job by the shore. I need 15 guys to go kelping. Everybody's like, oh yeah, because they can't afford to live only on their plot of land. Does that make sense? So again, it's this sort of nefarious approach to that. In all of this, right? We again, I mentioned a few moments ago, the hungry 40s, right? And that's where we come to here, right? So very famously, right? There is the Irish, and I call it the Irish-Scottish potato famine of 1845 to 57. Now, for most of us, right, we don't necessarily think of, or we know very little about the Irish potato famine as a whole, right? We know about it in terms of, maybe a little bit, right? Maybe we know that it occurs. Those of you who are native New Yorkers, right? Those of you who are native New Yorkers, you may know that, it is one of the reasons why New York has such a large Irish population, right? Because of the Irish potato famine. Maybe those are the reasons that you know about the Irish potato famine. Maybe that's why we have the largest St. Patrick's Day parade in the world that marches down Fifth Avenue because of this, right? And the book, Tom Devine in the book, right, starts out that first paragraph of the chapter saying that the Irish potato famine was the greatest human tragedy in Western Europe in the 1800s. Now, that's a very it's a bold statement to make, but it is important for us to be aware that it is a huge human tragedy, and one that is often overlooked. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So it starts with a fungal infection. So Jasmina, you ask, which borough has the most population in New York City? That's a very good question. I want to say Brooklyn is probably the largest by population. I know Queens is the most diverse, and I know Queens is the largest geographically, but I want to say Brooklyn is the most dense. That would be my answer. But again, that sort of has historical roots, right? Brooklyn is a just much denser area because it is a lot smaller. It's a lot older than Queens is, right? I mean, if you go out to places like Douglaston and Belrose, right? Those really far eastern portions of Queens, they're very late in terms of development, right? I mean, most of those homes are built in the 1950s, where in Brooklyn, most homes are built in the early 1900s. So yeah, I mean, that's a historical trend. So the Irish-Scottish potato famine starts with a fungus infection that reaches into Ireland starting in 1845. And this fungal infection, well, I'm going to butcher it, Phytophthora infestans, comes to Ireland via trade with North America, and ultimately destroys the population, destroys the potato crop in Ireland in this period. Now, for the people of Ireland and for people in general, right, there is no understanding of how this infestation, how this fungal infection winds up emerging in Scotland or Ireland in general. Now, they blame it on God. They blame it on each other, right? For the Irish, right? They blame it on the Catholics because because the poor working class are Catholics, and they say that this is sort of God's way of dealing with them. But in Scotland, right, it impacts the Highlands the most. The famine and the blight hits hits places that have mild winters that can't kill off the fungus or force the fungus into hibernation, and it impacts places that are particularly wet, which both Ireland and Scotland have above sort of what you might consider globally average rainfall. So when it hits these places, again, Scotland has a very moderate winter typically, and the same would be true for Ireland. Because they are both islands, they are surrounded by the North Atlantic. Temperatures do not really drop, really too far below freezing. And instead, because of that, you get, again, very, 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 very mild winters all throughout Ireland, Scotland, England. And for the Scots, right, the Irish potato famine reaches northern Scotland into the Highlands by about 1846. And when it hits Scotland, the devastation is pretty bad as well. But again, nowhere near as bad as what Ireland had endured. Alexandra, go ahead.
So like to clarify, it never reaches like that, like they called it like walking zombie stage and that Ireland reached, like where people were pretty much just like walking corpses at one point, and like
Correct.
there's no like obvious answer, like no, like, but we assume that unfortunately people had to like resort to cannibalism in Ireland. Like I'm assuming it never reached as far in Scotland.
That is correct. So in Scotland, there is never the sort of mass devastation that we experience in Ireland, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So in Ireland, so Ireland and Scotland have a very different relationship with the British Empire, right? So in the British Empire, right, Ireland, let's say 1845, right, or 1846 when it comes to Scotland. That's true, Michael. The Ottoman Empire sent aid. A lot of places send aid during this period, but that is absolutely true. The Ottoman Empire does as well. In Ireland, so Ireland, that discussion I had a few moments ago about crofting societies and how the land that they are renting is just so small that it can't even really support the family. That had been taken to extremes in Ireland, where sort of extended families had to work these sort of tiny little plots of land just to have enough food to even just scrape by, right? So like when the Irish potato famine hits Ireland, you've got mass devastation because people are farming such tiny plots of land that it is nearly impossible for them to survive. It also, Ireland does not have, because of that, Ireland focuses on growing potatoes, because potatoes are pretty high in calories relative to land space, right? So you can grow a lot of calories on a very small piece of land with potatoes. And because people are farming such small plots of land, they need to grow potatoes because it's the only thing that can provide enough calories for them to survive. Does that make sense? And because of that, when the potato famine hits Ireland and it wipes out their potato crop, I'm blanking on the statistic off the top of my head, but it's something like it reduces the potato crop by about 80%, right? And if the only thing that most people are eating is potato and it drops it by 80%, that is an unsustainable amount of drop, if that makes sense. That's not the same in Scotland. And this kind of goes to my point here about the third point on the Irish side, total reliance of the Irish people on potato. And that's my third point on the Scottish side, more diversity of food, right? In Scotland, there are other grains, right? There is not this reliance on potato. They grow barley, they grow wheat, they grow some corn. That doesn't really happen in Ireland. There's also fishing, right? On the shores, if you remember back to our conversation of the Highland clearances from a number of weeks ago, you'll remember that they move people to the shores for things such as kelping. Well, they can easily transition into fishing. That has not happened in Ireland. So I hope this makes sense, right? In Scotland, they were a bit better insulated from the famine because of the diversity of crops and a less of a reliance on the potato. Does that make sense? So for Ireland, the devastation is nearly immediate. As I say, yeah, so within Ireland, so Alexander asked the question, there were strict fishing rules in Ireland, right? Because the British kind of thought it would be natural selection. Yes, there were, and there were strict fishing laws. There were also other laws. There were a series of laws called the Corn Laws that prohibited the Irish from using their own crops. There were things that had to be sold, and they couldn't import certain crops. So even the small amount of crops that are being grown in Ireland have to be shipped out of Ireland, right? So it's like this really awful thing where people are starving, and some of the food that could save them is being shipped across to England or to other parts of the British Empire. Alexander, go ahead.
So is this sort of something like the idea, like the way that the England and Scotland did unionize, and the way that the structure of their union sort of benefited them in the long term versus in the immediate effect of not necessarily continuously fighting, but like developing a sort of structure that could sustain it? Because there's no doubt, like looking at this, like at this time period, like that Scotland is being treated better than Ireland. Ireland was given a max of a certain amount of aid. When the Ottoman Empire offered 10,000 euros, the English said, no, you can only give 2,000 because that's how much we gave. You can't give more than us. Like it was like almost like Scotland had the better effect because of things like Glasgow, and because of the idea of like so much of industry being in Scotland that England was somewhat reliant on, and also because the lords were so heavily based in England.
So I mean, everything that you said there is very accurate. One thing I would say is, Tony, do you have a comment on that, or is it another question you have?
Yeah, so I'd like to add to that as well. I think another factor that made the British, or at least the English in this case, favor the Scots over the Irish is religion, because the Irish were Catholic and Scots weren't. So the British, in that sense, favored the Scots more.
That's a very good point. So there's a lot of things to unpack there. First, Ireland was actually part of the United Kingdom at this point. This was not something we covered in the class because it didn't really fit. But Ireland becomes part of the United Kingdom after 1801. So Ireland is part of it. Tony is right about there is sort of this religious issue, which was that you have the Irish farmers predominantly being Catholic. So there was a less of an attention to trying to help the Catholics. But Alexander, I think your point about the industrialization, I think is a really good one, right? Ireland was not industrialized. Ireland did not have the industrial output that Glasgow and Edinburgh and other places had. So when the famine occurs, there is not the institutional ability for the Irish population to support this this blight, where in Scotland there is, right? And one of the things one of the things we'll talk about on the next slide, right, is that there is support from parts of Glasgow, parts of Edinburgh, that do buoy up the suffering of the people in Scotland. The final thing is, again, remember, the blight just is not as bad in Scotland as it is in Ireland. In Ireland, remember, we're going from about 80, we're dropping by about 80% the output of potato. When your entire population is eating potatoes on a daily basis and not much else, if anything else, when you drop that, that means people are going to be susceptible to illness. That means people are going to have calorie deficiencies, vitamin deficiencies. It's just not a sustainable situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
And then, Tanya's point, I think, is a really good one. This is one of the reasons that even though the word genocide was not invented even in the 1840s, this is one of the things that sort of people look back 200 years later and they say, this could be seen as a genocide. Now, I would add, I don't hold that view. I think genocide requires a more calculated approach, the way that we assign it to things like the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide. But I do think that it was neglect predominantly by the British government because of racial ideology, because of religious differences that do put so many people at risk in Ireland, if that makes sense. So here's a little story from the Haller Vault before we get on. And people who have their cameras off, if you'd like to join us for a little story from the Haller Vault, you're welcome to join us. Thank you to the 5 people who 6 people now. Oh, we lost one, who have their cameras on. I appreciate that. All right, so here's a story from the Haller Vault. About 12 years ago, I was on a trip to Ireland over Thanksgiving weekend with my now wife and my best friend and his sister. And we were in Ireland and we flew to Dublin and then get on this tour bus and we travel across Ireland to the city of Kilkenny. In the city of Kilkenny, we drop our bags and we are like, okay, we're going to go out for dinner. And we go out, we're walking around the city of Kilkenny and we see, so we were like, oh, we're gonna go get a beer. So we arrive and we're walking. All right, forget, we're gonna stop walking. The next bar we see, we're gonna go get a beer. We turn the corner and the next bar we see is a bar called Paris, Texas. And it's a cowboy bar in the middle of Kilkenny, Ireland. So, all right, forget it. We're not gonna go to that bar. We're gonna go to the next bar we see. So we turn the corner again, and there is a bar called the Republic. Now, I notice as we walk into this bar, right, there are no windows on the bar. I'm like, oh, that's a little weird. But we walk in anyway. So we go in and my buddy and I go over to the bar. We order some beers and we start, I'm a guy who just likes to talk to people. So I'm like, oh, hey guys, blah, blah, blah. They're like, oh, where are you from? I'm like, oh, from New York. And they're like, how'd you wind up in Kilkenny? Because Kilkenny is super tiny. It's not, I mean, it's a city, but it's not huge. Anyway, how do you wind up in Kilkenny? I was like, oh, well, we're on this tour, blah, blah, blah. The guy's like, oh, I was in New York once. That's great. We're chatting. And then one guy just turns to me and goes, you ever hear of the Irish potato famine? I was like, oh yeah, I've heard a little bit about it. And he's like, oh, that's okay. And he's like, they say that only 2 million, 2 million people die in this, but before the Irish potato famine, we had 8 million people. And then by the end of the Irish potato famine, we only got 2 million people. What happened to the other 4? And everybody's like, tell this guy to shut up, blah, blah, blah. He's like, no. Somebody tell me what happened to them. And then I'm putting this all together, right? We're in a bar called the Republic, no windows. This is an IRA bar that I've just brought the woman who I eventually will marry and my best buddy and his younger sister into. And I'm like, oh crap. So then I'm like, okay, let's just go sit and have our beers and we'll leave. The guy comes over and he's like, look, and one of the guys comes over and he's like, hey, I'm really sorry about him. He when he has a beer, he like gets a little fired up. I was like, don't worry about it. He's like, so you're from New York? You ever hear Frank Sinatra? And he starts singing New York, New York to us. So there you go. It turned out all right. We didn't die in an Irish pub, but we did get a rendition of New York, New York, and we got told some not terribly factual stuff about the Irish potato famine. Tony.
Yeah, so what I was gonna say is, from what I know about the IRA is that didn't they receive a lot of funding from like Irish Americans in like Boston and New York especially? So don't they look at like New York and Boston in a positive way because they receive a lot of funding from those cities?
They do, yeah. So there's a lot of like the Sinn Féin Society of New York, and there are a lot of groups of people who do send money in the early 1900s, and then certainly later in the 1950s and 60s to the IRA. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, so it was great. Yeah, from Momorgadov. Yeah, there's a lot of people who support the IRA. If nothing else, to give the British government a little bit of a hard time. I should also add. Yeah, but that's a very good point. I will point out here, right? Just one sort of small piece here about the Irish potato famine, the Irish side of the potato famine. So before the Irish potato famine, there were about 8 million people who lived in Ireland. After the Irish potato famine, there's between 2 and 3 million people that live in Ireland. And the population today of Ireland is about 6.5 to 7 million people. So Ireland has not yet recovered from the Irish potato famine 180 years ago. Does that make sense? Right. So like we're still living in that fact. I mean, there's been a lot of immigration, there's been a lot of other issues, but it is important for us to be aware, right, that Ireland never really recovers from, or has not yet recovered from this. So how does the blight spread to Scotland? It's the same way that it actually comes over from North America. It comes on ships. It's a fungus, right? So it's on people's clothes. There is a theory because of the jet stream and the way that it travels and the way that it's first reported in the southern portions of Scotland, that it actually comes over in the breeze. And because Scotland and Ireland are so close to one another, there is that theory. We don't really know, like there's no obviously like ship manifest that says, oh, we brought this, but there are these different theories of whether it's broke the person, a crop itself, or even on the wind.
But nobody thought it was done intentionally, like the British were plotting to get rid of Scotland.
No. Yeah, it was not like bio warfare. No.
Okay, thank you.
And Tanya, yeah, I mean, for a lot of Irish people, there is this belief that it is very much a recent event, and it does still impact a lot of the ways that Irish people think about the British. Yeah, absolutely correct. So, one of the things, and as we've been talking about, right, one of the things here for the Scottish, I think Alex brought this up, and I think, Tony, you brought this up as well, right? I mean, within Scotland, they were just better industrialized than the other parts, other parts of the British Empire. And it's important for us to remember too, right? And we'll talk about this in a couple of moments, that there was the Great Disruption of 1843 that broke apart the Scottish church, right? The thing that broke apart and gave us the Free Church of Scotland. That they do want to support, this sort of working class group of people. Again, those are sort of the bread and butter. If you remember back to last week, and there's also, and there are Edinburgh businesses, right? Edinburgh and Glasgow relief committees that are established with these sort of industrialists in these communities. There's a central board of management that, again, works to try and relieve the plight of these people. The other piece to this, right? And if you remember, and I'm just going to push this over for a second, if you remember, at the same time that all of this is happening, there's this, I showed you the website a couple of weeks ago called the New Statistical Account, which was the Scottish Church taking records of their flocks and their congregation. So there was already a very well entrenched connection between the local churches and this broader organization of the Scottish Church, right? The Scottish Kirk, the Presbyterian Church. And because of that, right, these ministers could make direct petitions to other people and say, oh, we need X amount of food, or we have this number of people who are starving. So it was a way for the Scottish Church to use their institutional connections to help the poor folk. And that's what I mean there when I say that local ministers are providing information on the neediest people. They can use their pulpit, they can use their place of privilege to connect to the wider institution and gain support. And through the Edinburgh and the Glasgow relief committees, they basically divide up Scotland, right? Glasgow takes sort of the far west regions. Glasgow, takes the far west regions of Scotland, while Edinburgh takes the more central and eastern portions of Scotland, so that money and resources can be distributed a bit more easily and a bit more efficiently. So the Scottish famine is sort of, again, the sort of last piece that we would sort of talk about here is in the Scottish famine. Again, because there was more urbanization, because there was more industrialization than there had been in Ireland, the Scots were a bit better insulated from the blight. But it's important for us to be aware here, right, that this does have major impacts. And this is one of the other ways in which people are removed from their land, right? If you remember back to the Highland clearances from a couple of weeks ago, and this would be around the same period, where people are moved from their lands because they can't pay rents, because the landlords can use that land more efficiently and effectively with the different types of sheep. Now, for the people who live in the urban environments, right? For the people who are industrialists, for the people who look at the famine, they blame it on the Gaels themselves, on the Highlanders themselves. They blame it on them and their sort of recalcitrance, their inability to modernize. As I say on the slide, it is seen as a way for people, for the Gaels to be given God's revenge. Now, one of the other pieces to this, right, is really messed up, and it's that there are a lot of people who are, quote unquote, assisted to immigrate. For a lot of landlords, it was cheaper for them to send people to Australia or Canada or the Caribbean. So that for a lot of Scots and Highlanders, one of the things that happens is they are moved. They are forcefully, or not so forcefully, right? Sort of just given given an option to move to wherever they want. And they were bought one-way tickets to places like Canada and Australia. So it was a way for them to, again, have that occur in a bit easier and cheaper fashion. So the Irish potato famine, right, is the Irish and Scottish potato famine is a hugely devastating event, right? It is something that kills millions of people through starvation. It's a way that it separates people from their land and their homes and forces them to flee into other parts of the world or into the other parts of the British Empire. It is a terrible situation, but again, I would not necessarily go as far as to say it was a genocide, because it lacks sort of the organization that is often associated with genocide. But it does nonetheless, I think, show sort of a failure of humanity. And again, it brings us back to one of those massive contradictions of the massive contradiction of Scottish society, right? This place of the Enlightenment, this place of religious fervor, but a place that, you know, is seeing its brothers and sisters dying and no one really caring or assisting. So I want to show us a little video. This is a kind of nice little video about the Irish potato famine. It does a really great job of illustrating some of the trickier pieces of it. So I'd like us to just take a few moments and watch it, and then we'll come back and we will discuss a little bit more. We'll look at a document as well. So give it your attention, please, and we'll come back in a few moments. If somebody could just give me a thumbs up if they hear the audio.
The first thing the farmer notices is the smell. An earthy rot in the fields. The Irishman walks into his potato field to find the plants turning brown and wilting. He digs up a tuber and finds it slimy like a bar of soap. When he slices it open, brown mucus oozes out. The whole crop is the same. It'll be a hungry year, but he will survive. Because this isn't Ireland in the famine year of 1845. It's the United States 2 years earlier. And this man has no idea how this blight will devastate the country of his birth. The Irish potato famine ranks as one of Europe's worst agricultural disasters. An event so momentous that it not only defined a generation, it scattered a people to the winds. When the blight arrived in 1845, Ireland had a population of 8.2 million. Within a decade, though, a third of it was gone. Around 1.1 million died from starvation and disease, while 2 million immigrated abroad. Actually, you know what? Strike that. Immigration isn't the right word. It was flight, plain and simple, an evacuation. During the height of the famine years, when children's mouths were stained green from eating grass and dogs scavenged graveyards, people brawled on the docks for space aboard the overcrowded vessels. Most didn't even care where the ship was headed, as long as it wasn't Ireland. Yet Ireland was not the only country, or even the first, to experience the blight. The fungus responsible emerged in the United States in 1843, hitching a ride to Europe in cargo holds. Farmers attempting to strengthen European potato strains may have even accidentally imported it when they crossbred their potatoes with American stock. And strengthened by a rainy summer and carried by the wind, the fungus stormed the continent. During the summer of 1845, news of the blight filled European newspapers. Belgium had lost 87% of its potato crop, Flanders 92%, Holland lost 70%. Germany and France got off relatively light, only losing a fifth of their harvest. Rumors of starvation leaked out of Russia and Poland, while English farmers saw similar devastation. Governments prepared for a season of hunger and instability. The potato, after all, was the staple diet of Europe's emerging industrial working class. This miracle plant, imported from Peru, could produce 2 to 4 times more calories per acre than grain. Cheap and easy to prepare, it allowed Europe's shrinking agricultural sector to feed its booming manufacturing workforce. And between 1750 and 1850, the European population nearly doubled, partially due to the potato. Any threat to the potato crop was a serious problem. In fact, these crop failures would help spur the wave of revolutions that racked Europe in 1848. But here the story of Ireland diverges, because while all these countries experienced economic hardship and social change, Ireland alone starved. The reasons for that are complicated, but they boil down to two factors. The first was a land system that made Ireland uniquely vulnerable to a crop failure. And the second factor was human. A group of British leaders governing from London who saw the famine relief as a vehicle for reforming the Irish economy and instructing the people's moral character. Throughout the crisis, British policymakers would make economic reform their primary objective, with saving lives as a distant secondary goal. The blight indeed was, as British politicians argued, an act of God, unstoppable and inevitable. The famine, by contrast, was the work of men. But that was still to come. In the summer of 1845, British Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel was tracking reports of blight. He worried about it striking England, of course, but he knew that if it took hold in Ireland, the result would be catastrophic. Technically, Ireland had been a part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland since 1801, but in a practical sense, it had been the very first step in the British colonial empire. The English had ruled it directly or indirectly for centuries. In that time, the British Crown had gradually dispossessed native Irish Catholic families, confiscating their land and gifting it to English and Scots Protestants who were considered more reliably loyal, while Catholic countries sponsored a series of Irish revolts against the Protestant English, and tensions grew. The climax came when Oliver Cromwell reconquered Ireland after a rebellion, completing the process of land confiscation and totally replacing Irish landowners with English and Scots, the so-called Anglo-Irish. And it was bloody. Conservative estimates suggest that Cromwell's invasion, along with the famine it caused, may have killed 10% of the Irish population. To prevent another uprising, Cromwell and later British governments passed a series of penal laws restricting Catholic rights. Catholics could not hold public office, own firearms, or be admitted to the bar as lawyers. They couldn't own a horse worth over £5, vote, teach school, or marry a Protestant. There were restrictions on how they could own land, and when willing land to children, they couldn't give it intact to the eldest, and had to break it up equally among all their children. Churches couldn't be built of stone and had to sit far from roads, and they couldn't attend universities at home or abroad, and 80% of the Irish population was Catholic. These laws were designed to bar Irish Catholics from all forms of political and economic advancement, and while they were gradually repealed, the last vanishing in 1829, it would take generations for the Irish to recover economically. And on top of that, these landlords charged astronomical rent on the land, barely allowing the native Irish farmers to survive. And the whole thing took place in a system of middlemen so convoluted that, okay, here's an analogy. Imagine someone owns an apartment building today. That's the landowner. They don't want to manage it, so they pass it off to a middle person to manage. Now the middle person wants to make a profit and knows there's a lot of demand, so they jack up the rent. And to make more profits, they subdivide some of the larger apartments into smaller ones. Now, under the pressure of making this exorbitant rent, some of the building's tenants start to get roommates or rent some of their bedrooms on Airbnb, further subdividing their own apartment. Wow, this sounds really familiar. Oh, hi NYC, I didn't see you in this analogy. Anyway, that's basically what happened to Irish farmers. In fact, some of the landowners, known as absentee landlords, hadn't even lived in Ireland for generations. The trend was bad. Then events made it worse. During the Napoleonic Wars, Irish goods suddenly became a major part of British imports, as the war cut off suppliers in France. Things improved for the Irish, with many turning to new manufacturing jobs. But then, Napoleon was defeated, French goods returned, and the burgeoning industrial sector collapsed. Out-of-work weavers and tradesmen flooded the countryside, engaging in ludicrous bidding wars for small plots of farmland, promising to pay rents the land could never sustain. Irish farmers began cultivating land that had never been farmed before: rocky hillsides, beaches, and bogs. The land, subdivided already through the inheritance laws and the greed of landowners, got subdivided further. And middlemen for those landlords, increasingly disappointed with returns from potato farmers, evicted whole villages to use the land for cattle raising, which squeezed the farmers even further. By 1841, 45% of all agricultural holdings were under 5 acres, a consequence of population explosion paired with a land system that depended on chains of landlords, often 3 or 4 deep, leading back to England. Only one thing allowed people to survive. You guessed it, the potato. A single acre of potato plants could produce 6 tons of crop per year, enough to feed a family of 6. No other crop provided such a yield. But many Irish families were larger than that, and the rent still had to be paid. In the decades leading up to the famine, the shrinking plots of land gave most no more than a subsistence living. Ireland was already the poorest country in Europe. Before the subdivision, most families at least had a cow. But in the decades before the famine, the more expensive cow disappeared, replaced by a pig. Milk, butter, eggs, and herring disappeared from the peasants' diets. Cash crops like barley and oats vanished, replaced by more potatoes. Visitors were shocked at the depth of Irish poverty. The majority of the country went shoeless, and many in the countryside wore literal rags. In towns, landless workers lived by the pawn shop, pawning their Sunday clothes after attending church, buying them back on Friday payday, wearing them to church again, and then repeating the cycle. But those same visitors were often astounded by the peasants' hardiness. Irish peasants were strong and often good-looking. Scientific testing, so popular in the Victorian age, found that the average Irish peasant was both taller and stronger than both English and Belgian ones, and it was due to their diet, eating nutritious, vitamin-filled potatoes 3 meals a day. But in August of 1845, Irish farmers walked into their fields and smelled rot. The blight was in Ireland, but London had a plan to use this crisis to remake Ireland, a plan that would bring down Prime Minister Peel.
Okay, so let's come back together. So when we look, right, so that I think video is a very helpful way to view, obviously the struggles that go on in Ireland, and the situation that brings it about, right? But as we've been saying, one of the major things about this period, right, is that it does not impact Scotland in the same way, or really even close to the same way. So as a result of that, right, we have to think about why that might be the case. And here, here's the reason why. We'll come to this document in a second. So part of this is that there had been a lot of shakeup in Scotland prior to the 1840s, right? If we think back to, going back to our conversation earlier about why Scotland was not as impacted, as Ireland, right? It's important for us to remember that, if the Highlands were going to be the place that were going to be largely impacted, well, then obviously, the Highland clearances that happened at the end of this at the end of the 1700s into the 1800s, or the splitting up of the Highland way of life after the Jacobite Rebellion of 1845-6, right? All of those things would lead us into the conversation there about why Scotland was not as impacted. There's also one other piece to this, right? One of the places that is growing large amounts of food to feed places like Glasgow and Edinburgh are the lowlands, right? Are the border regions, and you'll recognize this region here based on this map that I have on the lower right hand corner here. The border or the lowlands, so the borders or the lowlands are the area that I am circling now. This region that is south of Scotland, south of Edinburgh and Glasgow. This is a portion of Scotland that has really great Soil's perfect soil that is perfectly capable of growing, great crops, barley, corn, wheat. And this area is being dispersed earlier than the Highlands, right? So when the Highlands are dispersed, well, obviously first after Culloden in April of 1846, but then certainly later on when we get to the Highland clearances of the 18 teens and 40s to 30s and 40s. In the lowland areas, the clearances are happening a bit earlier. As early as the 1770s to the 1820s, you have this lowland clearances, the removal of people from these places south of Edinburgh and south of Glasgow. And this is one of the ways that people are, they're being forced into Edinburgh and Glasgow to work in these new emerging industrial centers. They're moving into towns, right? You'll remember, I hope, that by the time we get to the 1830s and 40s, something like 50% of Scottish people are living in towns larger than 10,000 people. So you're talking about this rapid urbanization, maybe not just to Edinburgh and Glasgow, but they're moving into places, if you look at the south, look at this area, right? I mean, they're moving into places like East Kilbride or Blantyre, or they're moving over here on the east side, right? They're moving into places like Dalkeith, Dunbar, right? These sort of border towns that are smaller economic centers, but they're also moving south of the border, right? Carlisle, Newcastle are places to which Scots and lowland farmers are moving. So the removal of these people, right, is a part of this attempt to consolidate ownership. And as I say here, on this slide, right, part of it is, Scotland is unlike other parts of Europe, and certainly unlike England, for instance. Land and land ownership was a very consolidated entity, meaning that, as I say here, there are 7,500 families that own almost all of the land. We're talking greater than 95% of all the land is being held by a small percentage of the families. And by the time we get to the later 1800s, that consolidation happens even greater, right? That consolidation occurs such that only about 1,500 people owned all of the land. I'm sorry, 1,500 families own all of the land in Scotland. So you're talking about massive consolidation of land, such that it becomes very difficult for this to have such an impact. Now, if we look at this document that is posted, so we've moved down to the second page of the documents. We're not going to look at the first one, right? But if you look at this second page of my document that I've posted in our Google Drive, right? One of the things about Scotland, right, and I've come back to a couple of times over the course of this evening so far, is that Scotland has a bit, Scotland, whether the Highlands or the Lowlands, has a bit greater diversity of product in terms of for output. So this document comes from that new statistical account that sort of that compendium of sources of focusing on the growth on different parishes throughout Scotland. So I'm going to ask you a really simple question, right? This document, right, is coming from 1845, just on the verge of the Irish potato famine. So what are the conditions that are being experienced here in Hamilton. So where is Hamilton? Hamilton is down here, just sort of southwest of Glasgow. So in this border region. So what is being experienced there, and what types of food are they growing here in Hamilton? All right, so take 2 minutes, read the document, think about that question, and we'll come back in 2 minutes. Okay, so what are the conditions that people are experiencing here in Hamilton, right? What are some of the crops that are being grown? What are some observations that we are seeing here from this document? So Eaton says the potatoes are inflicted with the rot, or affected with the rots, and there are worms and maggots in them. They only do turnips, carrots, and cabbages in the gardens, and the most important produce from this is the dairy cows, which produce butter and milk, right? That's a good point, right? It's important for us to remember. Can anybody remind us, right? What is the significance of cattle to Scotland? What is the significance of the black cow, as it were, to Scotland, as I may remember? Well, it's important for very good. Yeah, that's exactly right. So as Tanya rightly types it in the chat, right? It's the main source of trade. They were like money, right? Cattle is crucially important to Scottish economy, right? The cows are marched from sort of the central Highlands and sort of the just across the Highland line. They are marched down into the major urban areas, and they are sold for a really high premium, right? So it's important for us to remember. It's important for us to remember that cows are exceptionally important here. So when we get through the clearances and we get through the potato issues that Scotland endures in the mid 1800s, right? It's important for us to sort of also look at what impact does this have economically, and what impact does this have socially for the people of Scotland. Now, you might not think of this, right? But there are benefits to the thinning of the population, right? Through the Highland clearances of the early 1800s, through the lowland clearances of the late 18th century and early 19th century, through the potato famine and all of this, right? there are small benefits to the people of Scotland. So as the potato famine and other economic situations are emerging within Scotland in the mid 1800s, one of the big things to remember, and this again goes back to our conversation of cattle, and this is also apparent in the document that's there, right, is there is a falling, cattle becomes less important, and cattle becomes less profitable. Why? First, cattle are able to be brought from other parts of the world, which reduces obviously the demand for Scottish products, and the price reduces. The other piece to this is that by about the 1840s into the 1850s and into the 1860s, certainly, there is relative peace. There is relative stability throughout Britain. And as a result of that relative stability, there is no need to ship cattle. There's no need to ship beef or leather to other parts of the world to sustain British troops. And because the Napoleonic Wars end, and because the American Revolution ends, and because all of these sort of larger conflicts end, there is no need to send that food away. So again, price drops. But there's also another piece. It's not just that the price of cattle products drop, it's that the price of wool increases. Cows make way to sheep, and sheep become more profitable. You can shear the sheep and your sheep doesn't die. In order to get the leather from cows, you must kill a cow, right? And obviously that impacts future production, obviously. But that's not the case for sheep, right? For sheep, you can keep shearing them. For cows, you also must clear land. Cows need large pasture areas. You need to remove trees. You need to make it so that there are grassy hills. Not the case for sheep. Sheep can literally live anywhere. So again, there are different reasons why cattle prices drop. It's both larger, let's say macroeconomic, but it's also more local and less about that. Because of this, right? We want more people off land, and we can move people. There's also different types of movement, right? People from Scotland go to Canada, go to Australia, go to the Caribbean, go to India. They go all over the world. But there's also internal migration. And this is kind of what I was talking about a few moments ago about the lowland clearances, right? It's not just the case. It is not just the case that people are moving abroad, right? It's not just the case that people are moving to Canada or Australia or New Zealand or India, but people are moving also within, right? They're moving from rural areas to urban areas. They're moving to Edinburgh and Glasgow, but they're also moving to East Kilbride and Dalkeith and Dunbar and Stirling. They're moving to all of these different places. As well. So Sanzita says, let me go to this question. So Sanzita, your question is a really good one, right? If they can provide other products, why don't they want them? So, so your question is a good one, and that's a good point of piece of clarification. So I'm not talking about sort of individual farmers not wanting a cow, right? So like if I have my own little plot of land, I'm going to want at least a cow because I'm going to need I'm going to need dairy products, as you rightly say. But what I'm talking about is sort of the large scale cattle production that's moving thousands of cows a year from the Highlands down, right? So I'm not talking about small scale single farm ownership. I'm talking about like those massive, again, 40 to 50,000 cows moving. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's why, those big farmers who have 30, 40, 50,000 cows transition now to, oh, we can make a ton more money if we focus on just sheep, because we need less people, we need less cultivation, and it's really just throw the sheep in a field and let them reproduce, and we can shear them. I hope that makes sense. Okay,
Yeah, it
great.
makes sense. So I just wanted to clarify, they were thinking more in terms of what's going to profit them the best.
Excellent. That's right. Tanya, go ahead.
I know that like when like the landlords in Scotland and stuff, a lot of the times, like I was reading, they would get cattle from their tenants, and that was like their payment of rent sometimes, and then they would take that cattle and go to the market with it, and then that's how they would pay their fees for the land.
Yep.
So if the cattle became like less of a commodity, what did the tenants use to pay? Like, how did they switch over? Like, what were they paying their rents with and stuff like that?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a very good question. So there's sort of two ways to answer that, right? In places where so if you live on a piece of land or on an estate that had its own mill, so that it could take that raw wool and turn it into fabric, you would pay in kind, right? So that's what you're talking about, right? When I pay with a product and not with cash, I'm paying in kind. I would be using my wool as my payment. But the other benefit of wool production is I can sell my goods. If I don't live on a farm with a mill, I can sell my wool to a mill and get cold hard cash for it, and I can pay my rent in cash, which obviously landlords are going to like, because they don't have to do the work then of trying to sell bales of wool. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So we have this internal migration, and also part of that, right, is temporary migration, right? It's movement to different parts of Europe or even different parts of Britain for certain periods. If you want to move, for the winter, move to coal mining areas so that you could, for the winter, right, when people need coal to heat their homes, move to those areas when coal is in high demand, and then move back to the agricultural areas when agricultural work is beneficial, and just sort of bounce around based on the needs of the territory. But again, this is a new way to look at the clearances. All of this, though, right, is part of this larger economic connection that is occurring throughout Scotland, and there's the larger economic connection that is happening globally, right? We are no longer seeing just sort of small localized sales, and we are no longer just seeing sort of these small localized catastrophes. Instead, we're really looking at larger incidences, and these global connections are helpful to that, right? Because when we look at something, again, if we look back at the Napoleonic War and the end of the Napoleonic War, which then subsequently leads to the end of, or the lack of a need for the cattle trade. Well, I mean, that's global impact. And as I say here, right, cattle and sheep, grain and fish exports could increase through more industrial connections, but they could also reduce as well. There are connections between outer and inner parts of the Hebrides and the other parts of Scotland, right? I mean, I'll bring you back to our map for a moment, right? So where are the Hebrides, right? These are, this is Skye, these are the Hebrides. There are steamships that are now going up to these portions of the Highlands to collect wool, cattle, fish, kelp, all of these items that are being produced in the outer portions of Scotland and outer portions of the UK. There are greater connections to North America. Canada is producing huge amounts of wheat and barley and rye and all of these different products that are emerging. There's connections to India, right? Young men and young women are going out to India and other parts of the world to be part of the British Empire, to help spread Britishness. So all of this is part of these larger changes. As we transition to the final third of class, I want to look at how this changes the life of the people of the Highlands. So we've talked extensively, or I've talked extensively tonight, about the ways in which we get to this point and the causes that have occurred here. But there's also other pieces to that. And there are responses that the average people of Scotland are experiencing. So when we look at the economic dispossession, and when we look at the economic impact of the blight and of the terrible conditions of the land and the reduction in cattle prices, it's important for us to remember that these were real people and they had real responses to that. And here are two such responses. The first is something that is called the Battle of the Braes in 1882. So a brae is a hill. So this is called the Battle of the Hills. This event, right, is an event on Skye, so the island of Skye. So let me show you where that is again. So this is the island of Skye here in northwestern Scotland. And on Skye, one of the lords, right, was forcing his tenants off the land, and had stripped away the rights of the people to graze their sheep and their cows. So there had always been a right for the people who work on the land to allow their sheep and their cows to graze on that land. But in the late 1870s and into the early 1880s, this lord on the Isle of Skye had taken away that right. And the crofters, who again had experienced great loss, who had been dispossessed of their lands, are fighting for the right to graze their cattle and their sheep on historical lands. They fight fiercely. There winds up to being about 500 of these crofters who are using picks and clubs and rakes to fight against their landlord. And for about 10 days, there is this standoff until the landlord calls in about 50 Glasgow police officers to come in and disperse this. again, it's a way for them, for the people of Scott, the people of Skye to exert their authority. And again, it's these average people fighting for the rights that they have always had. It's these average people fighting against the system of this landlordism that existed in Scotland. You'll remember, I hope, back to about an hour ago, where I described the fact that within Scotland, there is really, really small consolidation of land, right? That there's only, the land is possessed by only about 7,500 families. So it's important for you to be aware here, right? That this is, when we talk about, the responses of these average people, they're taking on massive landlords. They're taking on people who are fantastically wealthy. Very good. Tony.
So I'd also like to add that it wasn't just land in the terms of land, but also, like, from my paper, what I learned was that even in the boating industry, like, for example, during the Great Depression, the Scottish boating industry ended up doing better in the Great Depression than the rest of the UK, because the Scottish shipbuilding firms were usually owned by big businesses rather than small businesses, which was the case in the rest of the UK.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Sort of this consolidation of ownership, right, helps so that when there is a downturn, there are greater resources for those owners to call upon. Yeah, that's a great point, Tony. Good observation and good point. So it's important, right, that there is this attempt by the lower classes to try and exert some sort of financial and some sort of small scale autonomy. This happens again. Sorry, this happens again with something called the Crofters Wars. So again, we are back in the Highlands in the 1880s, and these crofters, these small scale farmers who are living on lands that are in many ways so small that they cannot support a full family, are trying to fight against these landlords to give themselves some rights. Now, there had emerged a civic organization called the Highland Land Law Reform Association that was meant to advocate with lawmakers and with other groups of people throughout Scotland to try and improve the legal rights and the legal access to land. Now, this is not a super powerful organization, but it is important for us to be aware that there is this legal apparatus that exists to try and help the people of the Highlands exert rights throughout their own territory. And the people who are involved here is an interesting group of people. There are land reformers, right? There are people who want to see modernization of land occurring, but they also see that it can happen through the crofters, right? And the crofters who have worked land for so long. There are Gaelic revivalists, people who don't want to see the Gaelic language and the Gaelic culture removed from the Highlands, and obviously the Highlanders themselves. So the Battle of the Braes, right, starts. The Battle of the Braes starts in a lot of ways this push towards recognition for the Highlands. but it comes through in the middle period of the 1880s. And the sort of high point of it is the Crofting Holding Act of Scotland. So I've given you a small excerpt of it here. So this part is the part called the security of tenure. A crofter shall not be removed except for breach of statutory conditions. Okay, so I'm highlighting the section I'd like you to read. Take 2 minutes to read this, right? What are the conditions that could make a person or give the person ability to lose their land? Consent of their landlord, right? So all of this is exactly right. Good. The landlords also can come into the land as they wish. So it's important, right, for us to see that there becomes this obligation on both sides of the agreement, right? The landlord can come onto the land wherever they want, but the tenant can't be kicked off their land as long as they are paying their rent, right? As long as they are maintaining their portion of the bargain. The crofter cannot, damage a building, but at the same point, the landlord, has to keep it in decent condition. So what is important for us to see here about this law is it is making an obligation on both sides of the equation. And this is giving a lot of rights to the tenant, to the crofter, which they had not had earlier. And it makes the clearances in the ways that we saw earlier in the this is the 1880s, right? This is 1886. This is, if we look back 50 years to the 1830s or 60 years to the 1820s, and that first bit of land clearance that happens, right? I mean, the landlords are and the landlords through their factors are going through and burning down homes. They are forcibly removing people from their lands. So it's something that is certainly a big issue. And the fact that the tenants now have rights of protection, that's an important piece here. So as I say here, it guarantees security of tenure for the crofters as long as they are paying their rent, right? As long as they are up to date on their rent, they have the right to stay on that land. It also guarantees fair rent, right? It is not the case that a landlord, in order to get their people off the land, can just jack up the rent, right? Oh, I want you off the land. You don't want to leave? Well, let me give you a 50% increase in an annual basis and get you off that land. If you make an improvement, there is compensation to the tenant. This helps to limit the experience. This helps to limit in some ways the rights of the landlords. This helps to limit, or at least I guess a better way to say that is, it helps give authority and agency to the poor crofters. One of the really interesting things, and I found that, again, as I was preparing for tonight's class and I was looking back over the chapter, right, one of the things that struck me again about this is how reading becomes so important to this, right? We are in an age where literacy is significantly higher for the people of Scotland and the people of Britain in general. We are also in a period where there are daily newspapers and there is regular journalism. There's also really good traveling into northern Scotland. So it's kind of cool that, one of the ways that this law the Crofting Holdings Act of 1886, one of the reasons that it's passed is because of publications, because of newspapers, because people reading about the plight of the people north of the Highland Line. It sways public opinion towards the people of the Highlands, and it puts some wind into their sails. There becomes this massive interest in the Highland in the Highland life, right? I mean, if we think back again 100 years earlier, there was interest in the Highlands in terms of this mythical, romanticized area. Well, it's not romanticized anymore. It's a place where people are genuinely feeling bad for the folks that live there because of telegraph and steamship connections and railroad connections. People can now travel through the Highlands and see the lives of people. Highland tourism becomes a massive thing in this period, where people will take railroad cars and they will take trains, they will take steamships and go up the coast. They will see the Highlands, and they will experience the world that these people are living in. And again, there's all of this new interest that is emerging, both romantic and not, right? I don't want to make it sound as if this is like perfect. So when we look at this period, right, this is an era when greater rights are being given, not just to the people, not just to the urban people, and not just to the people who are living in the factories and working in the factories and having really difficult experiences, but it's also for the people who are living north of the Highland Line, and they're experiencing their own challenges, whether that's the blight or whether that's the blight or the impacts thereof, the falling economic troubles. So where do we go from here? So where do we go from here? By the time we get to the late 19th century, and certainly by the time we get to the early 20th century, there's a lot of migration going on throughout Scotland. There are large numbers of Irish coming across the Irish Sea. There are Polish people coming across. There are people from Scandinavia coming into northern Scotland or into Scotland, looking for those industrial jobs. You'll remember back to 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago now, when we talked about when I gave the lecture that was titled "The World's Workshop," right? Scotland in this period is one of the most industrialized centers in the world. It is a place that has huge numbers of jobs available for the average people. It has huge numbers of jobs that are open to the average people, and urban environments can sustain them. So it's a place that does draw people from all over Europe and all over the UK, the British, right? For the Irish, right, who are moving into Scotland, right, in 1841, just before the Irish potato famine, you're looking at a population of about 4.8%. By 1871, a mere 30 years later, that has gone up to 7.1%. Now you might think to yourself, oh, well, that's only 2.5% increase. Well, that's true, but if we think in terms of raw numbers, right, we have population growth that is exploding at that time. So in terms of raw numbers, you're talking huge numbers of people. And when we talk about migration studies, right, we talk about push and pull factors, and Ireland had plenty of push factors. Ireland had plenty of reasons why people would move out of Ireland. whether it was the famine, whether it was lack of industrialization, whether it was discrimination, right? Irish people, Irish Catholics could not go to school in Ireland, as that video showed us about an hour ago. But instead for the people for Scotland, you know, you were not disenfranchised. You could go to school, you could have opportunity. But again, just because they are moving there for poverty does not mean that they were welcomed with open arms. Within Scotland, there becomes huge tensions between the Irish Catholics and the Protestant Scots. And, you know, I think, as I mentioned last week, Scotland still experiences and Scotland still suffers from massive problems of sectarian violence and sectarianism, where, you know, when a Catholic team like the Glasgow Celtic play a match against the Glasgow Rangers, there are invariably there's an inevitable fights and violence and injuries that occur. And for the Catholic poor, they're going into these really low wage jobs, these poverty level jobs, that is making Scottish people unemployed, so that there again is this discrimination against the people who are taking those jobs. And the Irish are flocking to the jobs that are most difficult: the coal mining, the wool weaving, and the other jobs. Again, another story from the Haller Vault, right? I mean, my grandfather, my great grandfather, so my grandfather was born in Scotland, but my great grandfather was born in Ireland, and he left Ireland to go to Scotland to work in the coal mines. He spent his entire life working in the coal mines. Now he was a little bit later. He would not have been in the 1870s. He would have been in the early 1900s. But nonetheless, right, this trend continues. So it's important for us to be aware, right, that the economic changes that are going on in Scotland are having massive impacts. The cultural changes, the philosophical changes, the problems of sort of global connection, that we could have a blight break out in North America, as the video shows us, and spread across Ireland, have detrimental impacts, spread to the mainland Europe, and the impacts there, you know, obviously shows us that we are in a new age. And when we get to next week, we will look more at that new age that we are in, the 20th century, and how life is changing for those people. And we'll talk a little bit more about industrialization and the troubles that people experience. All righty. So, are there any questions?